You are hungry. It is a hunger that lives not in the stomach, but in the bones, a hollow ache that has devoured the memory of your last full meal. The year is 1349, and the world has been scoured by a pestilence so vast it has been given a name as stark and final as its work, the Black Death. It has passed through your village like a phantom reaper, taking the strong, the weak, the pious, and the sinner with an indifference that feels like a personal curse from God. Now, in its wake, another horseman rides. Famine. The fields lie fallow, tended by too few hands. The granaries are echo chambers for the scurrying of rats. Your children's faces are pinched and pale, their eyes too large, their silence a constant, screaming accusation. Every sunrise is a question of survival. Every sunset is a failure to find enough. And so you pray. You pray until your knees are raw on the cold stone of the chapel, until your voice is a dry rasp. You pray for a miracle. One day, the priest announces that your prayers have been answered. He stands before the congregation, his own face gaunt but his eyes alight with a feverish fire. God, in his mercy, has sent a sign. A new strain of rye, resilient and dark, has been milled into flour. This is no ordinary bread, he tells you. This is a gift of providence, a holy cure for the sickness that lingers not just in the body, but in the soul. He calls it the bread of penance, the bread of revelation. To eat, it is to purge the sin that invited the plague into your homes. It is to accept God's trial and, through that suffering, find salvation. He warns that the path may be arduous. There may be visions, tribulations of the flesh, a sacred fire that scours the wickedness from your marrow. This is not poison, he insists, but purification. And in your desperation, hope, that most dangerous and beautiful of human follies, blooms in the barren wasteland of your heart. You take the dark, dense loaf, its weight of promise in your trembling hands. You bring it home. You break it with your family. The first bite is earthy, slightly bitter, but it is bread. It is sustenance. It is, you believe, the beginning of your deliverance. You do not yet know that the deliverance you have been offered is not from suffering, but into a deeper, more intimate form of hell, a madness that will wear the face of God. The faint tingling in your fingertips is not the Holy Spirit. It is the first whisper of the fire. This descent into madness, disguised as a divine cure, was not a singular event, an isolated tragedy born of ignorance. It was a recurring nightmare woven into the very fabric of European life for centuries, a phenomenon we now know as ergotism. The story of communities driven insane by their daily bread is one of the most terrifying hidden truths of the medieval and early modern world. It reveals a grotesque intersection of biological chance, profound faith, and systemic vulnerability. It shows how institutions, desperate to maintain order and meaning in a chaotic world, could transform a natural poison into a tool of spiritual control, interpreting madness as sanctity and agonizing death as a form of grace. The line between a sacrament and a toxin, between a vision from heaven and a brain under chemical assault, was determined not by science, but by the iron grip of dogma. These are the forgotten stories of those who ate their damnation, believing it to be their salvation. If you believe that history is most powerfully understood by unearthing the stories of those who were silenced, by examining the systems that govern their lives and their deaths, then consider liking this video and subscribing for more explorations into the hidden corners of our past. We are a community of curious minds, scattered across the globe, but connected by this digital space. So please, take a moment to comment below and let me know where you're listening from. It is a small but powerful reminder that while these stories come from a distant past, our desire to understand them, to learn from them, is a living, breathing thing that unites us right now. To comprehend how a fungus could hold entire kingdoms in its thrall, one must first understand the world it terrorized. 14th century Europe was a society built upon a rigid, three-tiered hierarchy: those who fought, those who prayed, and those who worked. For the overwhelming majority, those who worked, life was a precarious existence, tethered to the land they did not own and subject to the whims of both their earthly lords and their heavenly Father. The peasant farmer or serf lived a life dictated by the seasons, a cycle of back-breaking labor that promised little more than subsistence. Their world was small, often confined to the village of their birth, and their understanding of it was filtered entirely through the lens of the church. The priest was not merely a spiritual guide. He was the source of all knowledge, the interpreter of all phenomena. An earthquake was God's displeasure. A bountiful harvest was his reward. And a plague, a famine, a stillborn child, all were incontrovertible proof of sin, a debt that must be paid through piety, penance, and suffering. This theological framework was not an abstract concept. It was a visceral, daily reality. The promise of eternal salvation in the next life was the only solace for the brutish, short, and often painful reality of this one. Into this world of faith and fear, the fungus Claviceps purpurea introduced a terrifying variable. The fungus, known as ergot, grows on rye and other cereals, particularly after cold winters followed by wet springs, a common weather pattern in much of Europe. It appears as dark, purplish-black growths, called sclerotia, which replace the normal grains of rye. To a modern eye, they are an obvious contaminant. But to a medieval peasant facing starvation, they were simply part of the harvest. Rye was the staple crop for the poor. It was hardy, it grew in soils where wheat would fail, and its dark, dense flour produced the heavy black bread that sustained millions. When the wheat harvest failed, people ate more rye. When all harvests were meager, every last grain was swept from the threshing floor and ground into flour, ergot sclerotia, and all. The mill, often controlled by the local lord or monastery, would process the grain for the entire community, ensuring that if the rye was contaminated, the entire village would be poisoned together. There was no alternative. To reject the bread from the Lord's mill was to starve. To reject the bread blessed by the priest was to risk one's immortal soul. The system, both secular and religious, ensured that the poison was not only ingested, but distributed with an efficiency that no single malevolent actor could have ever designed. The power of the church in this context was absolute, and its culpability, while complex, is undeniable. Lacking a scientific framework for pathology, priests interpreted the horrific symptoms of ergotism through the only lens they possessed, theology. The convulsions, hallucinations, and manic episodes were either demonic possession or a divine trial. The choice of interpretation was a potent tool of social control. A rebellious or questioning village might find their collective madness diagnosed as a demonic infestation, requiring harsh exorcisms, public shaming, and brutal penance. A pious and subservient community, however, might have their suffering framed as a state of collective grace, a shared spiritual ecstasy. The victims were seen as living saints, mystics touched by God, their incoherent screaming reinterpreted as heavenly language, their self-mutilation seen as a holy rejection of the sinful flesh. This interpretation had a deeply insidious effect. It discouraged any practical attempt to find the cause of the affliction. Why would one search for a worldly poison when the source of the suffering was the will of God? It turned victims against one another, as those with milder symptoms might be praised for their piety, while those who reacted with violent terror could be condemned as lacking faith. The system did not just fail to identify the poison, it actively consecrated it, transforming a toxic fungus into a sacrament of suffering. This sanctification of the poison was further codified by the very institutions that arose to deal with its consequences. The Order of Hospitallers of St. Anthony was founded in the late 11th century specifically to care for the victims of what was then known as Ignis Sacer, the sacred fire. Later, it became known as St. Anthony's Fire. The monks of the order established hospitals where sufferers could find succor. It was observed that when victims entered the hospital and stopped eating the local bread, their symptoms often improved. The monks attributed this to the intercession of St. Anthony and the holiness of their sanctuary, not to the change in diet. They inadvertently stumbled upon the cure without ever understanding the cause. They would feed the afflicted bread made from wheat, which was less susceptible to ergot, and the patients would recover, a fact that only reinforced the belief that the affliction was spiritual and could be overcome by holy intervention. Thus, the very system of care perpetuated the myth. The hospital became a place where the miracle of St. Anthony was proven time and again, while outside its walls, countless others continued to eat the bewitched rye, their agony seen not as a preventable illness, but as a failure to earn the saint's miraculous grace. The cure was right there, in the simple act of changing the food source, but it was a truth hidden in plain sight, obscured by a worldview that sought answers in heaven rather than in the earth. Let us descend now into the granular horror of such an outbreak, into a composite but historically faithful imagining of a village we will call Viridian, nestled in a damp river valley in 14th century France. The harvest has been poor, the rye dark and stunted. The Lord's reeve has collected the tax, leaving the peasants with barely enough to survive the winter. The priest, Father Michel, a man whose faith is as fierce as it is fragile, blesses the first loaves from the mill, holding one aloft. "This is the bread of trial," he proclaims, his voice ringing in the cold air. "God tests us. He asks if we love him enough to endure. Eat and show him your faith." The villagers, gaunt and desperate, obey. Among them is a young woman named Elodie, her husband taken by the lingering plague, with 2 small children to feed. She gives them the largest portions, watching as they devour the dark bread, her heart a knot of fear and hope. She eats the last, smallest piece herself. The indoctrination is subtle at first, a slow poisoning of the mind that mirrors the slow poisoning of the body. Father Michel's sermons grow more fervent. He speaks of the holy fire that will burn away their sins, of the visions that will be granted to the pure of heart. He tells them the tingling in their limbs is the touch of an angel, the creeping cold a sign that the body's profane heat is being replaced by a celestial coolness. The first stage of gangrenous ergotism begins. For Elodie's son, Luke, it starts as a pins and needles sensation in his toes. Within a week, he complains of a burning pain, a fire inside his skin that no water can quench. His feet begin to swell and turn a dusky purple, then black. The pain is so excruciating he screams day and night. Elodie rocks him, praying, weeping, remembering the priest's words about a sacred fire. Is this it? Is her son being purified? She looks at his small, contorted face, and the theological explanation feels like a monstrous lie, a cruel joke whispered from the pulpit. The daily life of the village disintegrates into a pageant of the grotesque. The affliction is not uniform. It attacks in 2 distinct and horrific ways. While some, like Luke, are consumed by St. Anthony's fire, others fall prey to the convulsive form. A blacksmith named Thomas, a man of immense physical strength, is found one morning in the village square, his body seized by violent, thrashing convulsions, his limbs jerking in a terrifying dance. His eyes are wide with a terror that sees things no one else can. He shouts about demons crawling from the well, about the sky turning to blood. The villagers who have gathered to watch are torn between pity and fear. Father Michel rushes to the scene, holding his cross aloft. "Behold," he cries, "a soul locked in combat with the devil. Pray for him. His struggle is our struggle." The seizure subsides, leaving Thomas limp and frothing at the mouth, his mind shattered. He is carried to his home, where he will be bound to his bed for his own safety, his wife spooning the same toxic bread into his mouth, believing it to be his only hope. The psychological impact radiates outward, infecting the healthy as much as the sick. Paranoia settles over Viridian like a shroud. Neighbors who have known each other for a lifetime now exchange suspicious glances. Whose sin was great enough to bring this upon them? The hallucinations of the convulsive victims begin to bleed into the consciousness of the community. When a woman named Isabel, in the grips of a psychedelic torment, shrieks that she sees serpents nesting in her neighbor's thatch roof, others begin to stare at the roof, their own anxious minds primed to see the same phantoms. The line between reality and shared delusion dissolves. Elodie, watching her son's leg begin to rot, the flesh turning black and hard like charred wood, feels her own sanity fraying. The constant screaming, the smell of decay, the utter helplessness, is a weight that presses down on her soul. She looks at her daughter, still seemingly healthy, with a desperate animal terror. She begins to hide a portion of their bread, burying it in the woods, not out of a clear understanding, but from a primal instinct that the source of her hope is also the source of her misery. The duties of life become mockeries of their former selves. A woman goes to milk a cow and is seized by a fit, collapsing into the mud. A man attempting to plow his field suddenly stops, staring at the clouds, speaking to saints only he can see, while his ox stands idle. The village is haunted by the dancing sickness, spontaneous outbreaks where dozens of people begin to leap, twirl, and scream for hours, sometimes days, until they collapse from sheer exhaustion or their hearts give out. It is not joyful. It is a frantic, desperate, and painful compulsion, their bodies puppets to a deranged master. And then comes the most unspeakable horror. A young mother, convinced that her infant is a changeling, a demon placed in her crib, throws her child into the river to send it back to hell. She is found later, sitting by the water's edge, humming a lullaby, a beatific smile on her face. When questioned, she explains that an angel with wings of fire told her it was the only way to save her baby's soul. Father Michel, his own mind perhaps teetering from the small amounts of rye he consumes, declares it a tragic but holy sacrifice, a test of faith as profound as Abraham's. The end of service, for the victims of ergotism, is brutal and final. For those with the gangrenous form, the service is a slow, agonizing decay. Luke's leg, now mummified and dead, falls off at the knee. The process is called dry gangrene. The tissue desiccates without infection, and sometimes, miraculously, the victim survives the amputation, albeit maimed for life. More often, the gangrene is wet, infection sets in, and sepsis carries the victim away in a tide of fever and pain. For those with the convulsive form, the end can be a sudden heart attack during a seizure, a fatal accident during hallucination, or a descent into a permanent state of psychosis, leaving them chained in a cellar, a living ghost haunting the edges of their family's life. There is no retirement, no reward. There is only mutilation, madness, or death. Elodie, having witnessed all of this, holding her now one-legged son, knows that the priest's promises are ash. The bread of revelation has revealed only one thing, that hell is not a place you go after you die, but a place that can be baked into a loaf of bread and served in your own home. Even in the depths of such systemic and overwhelming horror, the human spirit possesses a desperate, stubborn instinct for agency. Resistance did not always manifest as a grand rebellion. More often, it began as a quiet, gnawing suspicion in the mind of a single individual, a flicker of dissent in a world demanding absolute conformity. In our village of Iridian, this spark ignites not in a warrior or a priest, but in Elodie. Her grief over her son's disfigurement and her terror for her daughter's safety coalesce into a cold, clear certainty. The bread is not a test from God, it is a poison. This realization is, in itself, a profound act of heresy. To doubt the priest is to doubt the church, and to doubt the church is to doubt God himself. It is a thought so dangerous she can barely admit it to herself, let alone speak it aloud. Her first act of defiance is born of a mother's fierce pragmatism. She stops eating the bread entirely. She begins to forage in the woods for roots and berries, a dangerous and meager substitute. She secretly sets snares for rabbits on the Lord's land, an act punishable by mutilation or death. Every edible leaf, every stolen egg, is a sacrament of her newfound, terrible knowledge. This individual defiance soon discovers echoes in the quiet desperation of others. She notices that a few other families seem less affected. One is the family of the village outcast, an old woman named Margot, who lives at the edge of the woods and is whispered to be a hedge witch. Elodie, overcoming a lifetime of ingrained fear, seeks her out. She finds Margot and her grandson thin but clear-eyed, their small cottage free of the stench of sickness and the sound of screaming. Margot's secret is simple. She never trusted the priest or the Lord. She has her own small cornstone and grinds acorns and scavenged oats into a crude flour. She shares her knowledge with Elodie, not out of altruism, but a shared sense of otherness. The raven fears the flock, she says, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. Stay apart. An alliance is formed, a covert network of two, which soon grows. Elodie speaks to her cousin, whose husband is lost to the dancing madness. She speaks to a man whose wife threw herself from the church bell tower. She doesn't preach. She whispers a simple observation. My children ate the black bread. My son lost a leg. My daughter, who ate less, is still whole. I eat none of it now. I am still myself. The resistance escalates from passive avoidance to active sabotage. The women begin to organize. When they're called to help at the communal oven, one of them might accidentally spill a bucket of water on the fire, delaying the baking. Another might secretly mix harmless but foul-tasting herbs into a batch of dough, hoping people will reject it. These are small, desperate acts, whispers of rebellion against an unassailable power. But the most daring plan is yet to come. They know the Lord keeps a private store of wheat flour for his own household, locked away in a separate granary. Led by a quiet, grim-faced man named Jean-Paul, whose entire family was wiped out by the convulsive plague, a small group of villagers plans a raid. It is not a riot. It is a covert operation, planned in hushed tones in the dead of night. They are not seeking to overthrow their master. They are simply trying to steal the antidote. The plan is an act of supreme collective courage, pitting unarmed, starving peasants against the armed guards of a feudal lord. It is a gamble for their very lives and sanity, a declaration that their survival is more important than the laws of property and the dictates of faith. The system, however, does not tolerate such defiance. Power, especially power built on a foundation of unquestionable authority, reacts to challenges with ferocious brutality. The raid on the wheat granary is a disaster. A loyal servant alerts the guards, and Jean-Paul's group is caught in the act. The retribution is swift, public, and designed as a gruesome piece of theater. It is not enough to simply execute the rebels. They must be made into a lesson. Father Michel, his authority directly challenged, is at the forefront of the condemnation. He does not see starving people seeking wholesome food. He sees heretics, minions of Satan who rejected God's holy trial and sought to steal what was not theirs. He declares them possessed, their minds twisted by the devil into blaming the sacred bread for their afflictions. Jean-Paul and two others are brought to the village square, the very place where their neighbors had danced and convulsed. They are accused not of theft, but of blasphemy and witchcraft. The punishment is a spectacle of pathological cruelty. Jean-Paul, as the leader, is sentenced to be burned. The fire that consumed the minds and limbs of his family will now consume his body. But before that, he is tortured. The guards, following the Lord's orders, break his hands and feet, a symbolic punishment for his attempted theft and trespass. As he is tied to the stake, Father Michel holds up a piece of the dark rye bread. Reject the devil and accept God's penance, he screams over the crackling of the flames. One bite, and he may yet have mercy on your soul. Jean-Paul spits a mouthful of blood toward the priest and is consumed by the fire, his final act of defiance a silent scream against a merciless sky. The other captured rebels are made examples of in a different way. A woman has her tongue cut out, so she can no longer spread her poisonous lies about the bread. Another man is branded on the forehead with the mark of a heretic and exiled, doomed to wander the land as a pariah, a living warning to all who might question the narrative. The most insidious retribution is reserved for Elodie. Her role in the resistance was suspected but never proven. Instead of public punishment, she is subjected to a psychological torment designed to break her spirit and reassert the system's control. Father Michel declares that her son's survival, despite his mutilation, is a miracle, a sign of Elodie's hidden piety. She is brought before the congregation and forced to give testimony, to thank God for the sacred fire that purified her child. She is made to hold up the dark loaf and praise it as the instrument of God's will. To refuse would be to confess her heresy and invite the same fate as Jean-Paul. To comply is to become a collaborator in the lie that has destroyed her life. With her surviving daughter standing beside the priest, a silent hostage, Elodie makes her choice. She mouths the words of praise, her voice a hollow echo of itself, the taste of ash in her mouth. She performs her part, becoming a tool of the very indoctrination she fought against. It is a victory for the system, more complete and more devastating than any execution. They have not just killed the rebellion. They have forced the resistor to sanctify her own chains, demonstrating to all that in this world, survival could be a more profound form of damnation than death itself. The reign of St. Anthony's fire, while terrifying, was not eternal. Like all systems built on a foundation of falsehood, it was vulnerable to the slow, creeping assault of knowledge. The evolution away from this particular form of mass suffering was not a single dramatic event, but a gradual process of change driven by shifts in agriculture, science, and societal attitudes. For centuries, the cycle continued. A wet spring would be followed by a summer of madness and death. The Order of St. Anthony would provide care, prayers would be offered, and the fungus would lie dormant until the next favorable season. Yet within the very institutions that perpetuated the myth, seeds of understanding were inadvertently sown. Monks in the Annonite hospitals, through simple, repeated observation, began to codify the one reliable cure, a diet free of rye. While they continued to attribute the healing to the power of their patron saint, their practical success created a body of evidence that would later be re-examined through a more secular lens. The first significant drivers of change were not medical, but agricultural. As Europe slowly modernized, farming techniques improved, crop rotation became more sophisticated, and in many regions, particularly those growing wealthier, wheat began to supplant rye as the staple grain for all but the poorest citizens. Wheat is not immune to ergot, but it is far less susceptible. The simple act of shifting a region's primary crop could cause the holy fire to vanish for generations, a fact that mystified theologians but powerfully demonstrated an underlying environmental cause. Furthermore, new methods of cleaning and sifting grain, introduced in the 16th and 17th centuries, helped to physically remove the dark, obvious sclerotia from the flour. These were practical, economic decisions, not public health initiatives, but they had the profound effect of slowly starving the phantom that had haunted Europe for 1,000 years. The disease began to retreat to the poorest, most isolated regions, the places where rye was still king and agricultural practices remained unchanged. The true intellectual shift occurred with the dawn of the Enlightenment. As the scientific method began to challenge faith-based explanations for natural phenomena, physicians and botanists turned their gaze to old mysteries. In 1670, a French physician, Dr. Thuillier, published a report explicitly linking a recent outbreak of gangrenous ergotism near the city of Orleans to the consumption of spurred rye. He was not the first to suspect it, but his work was part of a growing wave of scientific inquiry that was becoming harder for traditional authorities to dismiss. He described the fungus, detailed the symptoms, and noted that the wealthy who ate wheat bread were spared. He called the disease a poisoning, not a divine punishment. This was a radical reframing. It moved ergotism from the realm of theology to the realm of toxicology, from a matter of sin to a matter of public health. Over the next century, further research solidified the link, and by the end of the 18th century, most of the educated world understood the true cause of St. Anthony's fire. Legal reforms began to follow, with some principalities enacting laws requiring the cleaning of rye grain before milling. The change was slow and met with resistance, but the spell was broken. This sacred fire had been exposed as a common poison. Yet, the legacy of this terror did not simply vanish. It lingered in the cultural memory, in folklore, and in the very language people used. Tales of bewitched villages, of dancing plagues, of people who saw demons and felt their flesh burn from within, became cautionary tales, their true cause forgotten and replaced with superstitions about witchcraft and curses. This very confusion may have played a role in one of history's most infamous cases of mass hysteria, the Salem witch trials of 1692. A modern theory, proposed in the 1970s, suggests that the strange behavior of the afflicted girls in Salem, the convulsions, the visions, the sensation of being pinched and bitten, was consistent with the symptoms of convulsive ergotism. The rye crop in the region had been grown in conditions favorable to the fungus, and the symptoms were concentrated among the poorer households that would have relied on it. While the theory remains a subject of academic debate, it presents a chilling possibility that the tragic events at Salem were not born of malice or religious fervor alone, but were sparked by a biological poison, with the existing puritanical belief system providing the framework of witchcraft as a ready-made explanation for the terrifying and inexplicable symptoms. Perhaps the most shocking testament to the enduring power of this ancient scourge is how recently it struck again. The horror was not confined to a superstitious, pre-scientific age. On August 16, 1951, in the small French town of Pont-Saint-Esprit, the nightmare returned. Over 300 people were suddenly struck by a terrifying affliction. They suffered from intense hallucinations, burning sensations, and violent psychotic episodes. One man, convinced he was an airplane, jumped from a second-story window, breaking both his legs. Another tried to drown himself, screaming that his belly was being eaten by snakes. A young girl described seeing tigers attacking her. The town was plunged into a state of mass insanity that lasted for weeks, resulting in 7 deaths and dozens of people being committed to asylums. The local bakery was identified as the source. Initially blamed on mercury poisoning, the prevailing scientific consensus now points firmly to ergot poison flour. The baker had unknowingly purchased contaminated rye. In the mid-20th century, in the age of penicillin and nuclear power, an entire town was driven mad by the same medieval plague. This modern outbreak serves as a terrifying epilogue, a reminder that the veil between our orderly world and the ancient horrors of the past is dangerously thin, and that the specter of St. Anthony's fire, though largely banished, has never truly been exorcised. It waits patiently within the earth for the right conditions of rain, cold, and human desperation to rise again. In closing, we must look back upon this long, dark history of suffering and ask what it teaches us. The story of ergotism is a story of dual torment. It is the narrative of a body in revolt, of limbs turning to charcoal and falling away, of a mind besieged by phantoms, ripped from the moorings of reality by a relentless chemical assault. This physical and psychological agony is a horror profound enough on its own. But the true, systemic tragedy of St. Anthony's fire lies in the second layer of suffering, the one imposed by human systems of belief. It is the story of having your agony consecrated, your madness called a miracle. It is the torment of being told that your child's excruciating pain is a sign of God's love, and that the poison you ingest daily is a sacrament. This transformation of a preventable illness into a test of faith represents one of the most pathological abuses of institutional power imaginable, an abuse born not always of malice, but of a rigid ideology that could not permit a reality it could not explain. The central theme that emerges is one of profound vulnerability. It was the vulnerability of the peasant, whose life depended on a single, hardy crop. It was the vulnerability of the desperate, who, in the face of plague and famine, would accept any promise of a cure, no matter how outlandish. And it was the vulnerability of a society that lacked the tools of science, a society that had no choice but to interpret every mystery and every tragedy through the powerful, all-encompassing narrative offered by the Church. The courage in this story belongs not to the priests who framed the narrative or the lords who enforced it, but to the forgotten victims who endured the unendurable, and especially to those few who, like our imagined Elodie, dared to trust the evidence of their own senses over the pronouncements of authority. Their resistance, whether it was the secret burying of a piece of bread or a doomed raid on a granary, was a fight not just for their lives, but for the very concept of reality itself. The moral lesson for our own time is stark and deeply relevant. We live in an age awash with information, yet we are arguably as vulnerable as ever to seductive falsehoods, especially when it comes to our health and well-being. We see echoes of the bread of revelation in the snake oil cures peddled on the internet, in the conspiracy theories that reject overwhelming scientific evidence, and the charismatic leaders who demand faith over facts. The story of ergotism is a brutal reminder that desperation is a powerful solvent for critical thinking, and that systems of power, whether religious or secular, can exploit that desperation for their own ends, demanding belief in a cure that is, in fact, the very source of the disease. The rights and freedoms we so often take for granted, the freedom to question authority, the right to scientific literacy, the expectation of public health protections, were not granted from on high. They were won, slowly and painfully, over centuries of struggle against the very kind of dogmatic thinking that allowed St. Anthony's fire to burn for 1,000 years. Therefore, we must call upon ourselves to remember these stories. We must remember the faceless thousands who suffered and died, their pain misinterpreted and their legacy nearly erased. We must remember them not as superstitious curiosities of a bygone era, but as victims of a systemic failure to value human life and observable truth over the preservation of a comforting but deadly narrative. To remember them is to honor the immense human cost of ignorance. It is to affirm our commitment to the principles of inquiry, empathy, and intellectual courage that eventually brought the long nightmare to an end. Their silent screams echoed down the centuries, a permanent and chilling warning. In the end, the history of ergotism poses a final, haunting question about the nature of reality and belief. When a community's shared reality is dictated by an institution, and that institution consecrates a poison as a sacrament, what is sanity? Is it to accept the consensus, to praise the holy fire as it consumes your flesh, to see angels in the throes of a seizure? Or is it to stand alone, to trust your own senses, and to be condemned as a heretic, a madman, or a witch? For centuries, millions of people were forced to make this impossible choice. Their story is a testament to the terrifying power of a single, well-told lie, and a solemn reminder that the most dangerous demons are not the ones that haunt our visions, but the ones we willingly invite into our homes, bless at our altars, and break as bread.